Hey guys, Wintermute Digital here, and this week we're going to be finishing our robot character model. We're going to go over how to make these three materials. So we have carbon fiber, a glowing cable texture, shader, and a lens. And when we're done with that, we're going to have our completed robot model, as well as a backdrop, lighting, and some decals. So let's get started. Now the source file for this will be on my website, so you can check that out in the description. And we're going to start here. Alright, so this is the initial robot model. I've made like a couple of very small modifications, mostly these three panels, and I've cut some more holes to the front like I've done on the sides. So let me just extrude this out just a bit. Okay, so now what are we going to do with this model? Well, first, let's create our materials. So I'm going to be creating the carbon fiber material first. So we'll call it carbon fiber. And we'll go into the shading tab. Now, we want to use the Eevee renderer for this just because it's a lot faster right now, and we don't really need the precision of cycles at the moment. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a image texture right here, and I will have the source file for this image texture up as a link in the description somewhere. So we're going to apply this to all of the pieces of the mesh that will have it. So that's all of the arm and leg joints, as well as the 2 feet. An easier way to do this is to just select our center mesh by shift-clicking and hitting Ctrl-L in materials, and all of them will inherit the same material. Let me turn on my screen cascades for a second. Alright, there we go. So now you can see none of this is particularly even, so we just need to UV unwrap it. Now, I'm going to be lazy here, and because this isn't a complex custom texture, we can just use the simple UV unwrap. And in Blender 2.8, there's a new multi-edit function which allows us to edit multiple items at once. So what we can do is we can select all of these items, we can hit U, Smart UV Project, hit OK. And you can see that the projections change somewhat. So now we're going to have to do a little bit of editing to this material. So first we're going to add a texture coordinate node, and this will just tell us where our UV coordinates, or where our texture is going to get projected from. So we want to make sure it comes from our UV map as opposed to our generated map. Next, we can add in a mapping node to control just how this texture is projected onto the mesh. So we want to increase the scale up a lot on the X and Y axes so we can actually see the pattern of the carbon fiber material. And yeah, so if we can zoom in on some objects, we can see that carbon fiber, but it's not super convincing. So what we actually want to do now is add on a bit of bump mapping. Now if we just straight put it into the displacement, it's going to be a bit excessive. So we can diminish its effect by adding a multiply node. So we add a math node, and then we can multiply the bump mapping value by 0.1 say, or we can set that to even lower. And you just want to play with this until you have a good shadowing effect. Let's add a light to the scene just so we can see this a bit better. So we'll have it hovering just above our robot at a slight angle, and we'll increase the strength. And we'll be able to see this pretty well. Alright, now let's create the lens material. So our lens material, we're going to have to select our lens section for this. So make sure this whole area is shaded smooth, because if we have all these jagged edges, it's going to break up the shiny glassish effect. So we want to just select all of these faces and double click to do that, and hit face and shade smooth, and then we'll have everything here smooth shaded. Same goes for these faces. Face, shade smooth. Alright, so now let's add a lens material. To select everything in a circular region like this, Blender actually has a pretty useful circle select. So you can hit C to enable that mode, and then just have it at the size that you want, and then just click once. You can hit escape to get out of that mode. And now just select whatever you missed. It's much easier than selecting on the edge loops individually. Okay, so if you want, you can go to wireframe to make sure you didn't select anything you didn't mean to. And then, oops. And then we can assign it our new lens text, lens shader. So this is going to be a very simple material. All we have to do is we need to darken the color a little bit. We're going to turn up the metallic. So this is a preview of what it would look like. So right now that looks a bit fuzzy, which is because we have a high roughness. So in order to change that, we'll just turn the roughness pretty much down to 0. And so we have that nice glassy look. Right now there's not too much accents or reflections because the whole world is just the same color. But once we change that, it'll look a lot better. For example, we can put a point light right in the middle somewhere. And you can see that getting reflected off the lens. And it'll look pretty good from this angle. So I forgot to select this, so let's just apply our carbon fiber material to it. And let's unwrap this as well. Alternately, I believe we can also give it the lens material, and it would still look decent. Now, okay, so the cable material. This is going to be another pretty simple material. So we're going to add a new one. We can actually turn down the background intensity a little bit. So we're going to add a new material here. And we're going to add in... So what we want right now is to have on the outside a sort of glowing effect, and on the inner core a more diffuse effect. So we can control the outer edges of an object by using an element called Fresnel. So we'll add that in. And this is sort of the area you see around, say, a sphere of glass, the brighter area. Then we're going to use that to control the mix shader. We're going to add here. And we're going to pair it with an emission shader. So now you can see that along the edges of this material we have a bright spot, and it doesn't matter the angle that you're looking at, we have this bright outline on the edge. We can change the index of refraction value to alter this, but if you leave it at 1.45, which is the default, which is the physical value for glass, then it should look fine. Now we can turn up the strength of this emission as you like, and you can also change the color a bit. So if you want, you should probably decide about a color scheme. I'm going for blue here, a cyan sort of color, but you could just as easily go like yellow or magenta or whatever you like. I'm going to go for sort of an aqua sort of color. Now we can give the other cables the same color. Oops. So we'll call this cable. And we'll give this one the same material, as well as these two. Now you can see that they actually react to the ambient lighting, so we can change that a bit. if we increase the strength of the emission shader. But you can see that this is a pretty cool effect, right? We have a sort of outer glow, and it kind of amplifies close to the edges. Now we can always increase the strength of this if we want the effect to be more pronounced, but if you go too high, what can happen is that you won't be able to see the center. You want to also make sure that we have bloom on, which allows us to see that glow effect, which really accentuates the vibrancy of the model. Now for this magnet, I think we can just assign this to lens material. So I was thinking to just have a pretty shiny sort of magnet, and this gun, I don't think it matters too much. It's more of a placeholder for something, so it's not too important right now. But yeah, so now let's give this model a couple of accents because we can't really see anything. So when we do this, we should probably think about where it would make sense to do so. And since this model has so many sort of cuts into the interior, my idea is that these cuts would sort of expose an inner light to this material. So where we have a normal surface, we just shade it with a carbon fiber, but where we can actually take a glance into the material, like these vents, we can actually shade this with some color. Now, I don't know of any actual way to select these that's faster than just doing it manually, so you may have to do that. To apply this material, all we have to do is hit plus here. We'll change this to the cable material again. And then, there we go. So you can notice that the intensity of this light actually depends on the angle at which we're viewing it, which is part of how the Fresnel node works. You probably want to be... So now selecting these ones is going to be a bit difficult. But you can do it, it'll just take a while. Perhaps discount every other one. Okay, so I suppose that alternately, since all of these sort of connect to the same face, what might be faster is if you just box selected this, and then deselected the components that you don't actually want. And as you can see, that's considerably faster. So let's use that. And we can see this glow coming out. Great. Now, if we want to make this, customize this a little bit, we can actually hit that 7 over there, and we can turn it into a single user material, so it's only applied to, this material is now unique, it has a different name. So we can actually change it now, and everything here is going to be the same. So let's try to give it the same color as our cable material. But I think that edge effect is a bit too harsh and kind of unnecessary for these plates. So all we need to do is just turn up the color, the emission strength. So we have these sort of forward-facing lights and these side-facing lights. And it's all connected together. Alright, now, so we want to do the same thing for these leg segments. So, see, wherever we have these cuts into the model, we want to have those glowing. So we'll just select all of them with our box select. Then we're going to add the material again, as we did before. So you don't want to use multi-edit while you do this because it's not actually going to work. So we'll just do it with one object at a time. Make sure to go into wireframe mode because it's a lot easier to select these bits. And you'll notice that I have a lot of leftover materials. What Blender is supposed to do is that if you save these and they have a 0 beside them, those materials will automatically be deleted, but I'm not sure why that didn't happen. So if you save and reload, you shouldn't be able to see those materials anymore. Let's select these edges again, or these faces again that we want to have highlighted. We'll apply an accent, and there we go. So this is essentially what we wanted from the start. Where we have our physical details in the modeling, we also have material details in the lighting, which is a good complement to make. Now, for another effect, if you want to add decals to an object, there are a couple ways to do this. A really simple one is by using a text object. So we'll rotate this 90 degrees. And since this is flipped, 180 degrees. So if we want to actually connect this to the mesh, let's edit this first. So you can call this whatever you want. R3D3, I don't know. That's what I called it before, no particular reason. I just like Parasite too. Now, we can change the font by going into fonts. And I have a couple of fonts on my system. You can go with whatever you think looks good, and you can find a lot of these online pretty easily. So you'll want like a techie looking font. I have one called Cyberfunk, which looks pretty cool. And now you want to position this close to your mesh, but it doesn't exactly matter where. And that's because we're going to use the shrink wrap modifier. So we'll click shrink wrap here, and then we'll select our object that we're going to attach it to as if we were shrink wrapping this with the eyedropper tool. Now, you'll see that it's gone. Why is that? It might have attached to something that's not actually there. Oops. Let's make sure this armature is hidden. Let's find that text. So it seems to have actually attached to this vertical face, which is not good. So we can actually move this on the Y direction, like that. So you see, if we didn't have the shrink wrap modifier applied, it would actually look like this. And it basically just projects it. So it attaches each point on this mesh onto a point on this robot chassis. And it does that with pairing the nearest surface points. So if we want to have the projection, we want to have this around the area that we want to project it onto. So let's re-enable seeing that. And so we can move this around. Note that if you actually move it behind the geometry, like this, it's not actually going to work. So don't do that. Instead, we want to move it somewhere that makes sense. And you should have these faces, it doesn't matter if they're parallel or not, you should try to make sure they're not perpendicular. And we want to set this offset. So by default it's 0, which means we're going to see some Z fighting where these faces are completely overlapping. So we want to add a very, very small amount of offset, like 0.001 or something like that, just so they're not actually colliding. And we can give this its own material too. Or we can be lazy and we'll just use the cable material that we had before. Alright, so for settings, we want to make sure we have a couple of them enabled. We need to have freestyle, so we have an outline around our mesh. We want to have screen space reflections so that we actually see reflections in Eevee, because Eevee doesn't always process these completely, and you'll see if without it, it doesn't actually process like reflections in real time with other objects. We also want to have depth of field, and so how we can control that is if we take our camera, we go into the camera options and select depth of field, and we can have it focus on an object. Let's say we want it on our robot, which makes sense. we can change the f-stop to control the blurriness. And you'll see that gun go in and out of focus as I lower and increase the f-stop. This isn't too important right now because we don't actually have any other objects in the scene. We also want to make sure that our camera aspect ratio isn't too far off. So by default it's very wide, and since our robot's kind of tall, we actually want to make this a taller sort of image, so we can change our resolution. If you don't want to work out how to get a higher resolution, we can actually just multiply by this percentage. Higher percentage is higher resolution. That should be obvious. Alright, so I think I missed a couple of spots here. So let's add a bit more color. We'll call this accents. Alright. Let's also give this one the accents material. Then we can slide this around to somewhere that looks good. And we can even also edit it while it's on the mesh. And you can see how this cursor is vertical, but we're actually editing the projection onto the face, which is pretty cool. Alright, so now for some scene setup. Let's delete this point light because we don't need it, and let's pose this properly, and also add a backdrop. So we can just add a plane. That'll serve as our backdrop. And then the trick to making a sort of smooth background is we're going to go into side view. We're going to extrude this straight upwards. So we have something like this, select this edge, and bevel it. Oops, I made an extrusion. Okay. Extrude it upwards, select, and bevel it. And you can scroll up on the scroll bar just to increase the segments, or I think you can just type in a number and it'll do that. It doesn't have to be too high. Then we need to shade the smooth, so right click and shade smooth. Let's make sure it fits on the screen, so you can scale it up on whatever axis you need to. And that's looking pretty good. Let's pose this so that our shadow is directly overhead. We also probably want that gun not to be too big, so we can actually increase the distance a bit. Now to give this a material, and make sure it's just about touching the feet of the robot. We want to give it something that will contrast with the body of our robot. If it's like black, we're not actually going to be able to see anything. So we want to have it a bit higher, something slightly lighter than that. We'll give it a bit of reflectivity with the metallic and turning down the roughness. Not too much because we don't want to reveal too much of our scene. We want to center the camera on our robot. Now let's add a couple more lights. Let's have one here on the left side, positioned sort of from the top. And you can see that this casts a pretty harsh shadow. We can actually remove that by just clicking the shadow. And we can increase the shadow on this one by turning up the power. Scale it down a bit too. Okay, that's a bit too much. Let's make sure you have contact shadows on. And we'll just play with this lighting until it sort of looks right. I'm not really an expert on lighting, as you can probably tell. But basically what we're trying to do is highlight the parts of this robot that are important. We want to give some nice reflections to the scene. You can see that this lamp is actually adding reflections to the lens, which is pretty cool. If you accidentally unhide your armature, you can press H to hide it again. If you want this to be more flat looking, you also might want to turn up the roughness of this background material. And we can also give this a color that sort of harmonizes more with our robot character. So we can give it a sort of bluish color. We want to make sure the saturation is not too high, otherwise it might sort of overwhelm our character. We can turn it down a bit. So let's give that a quick render just to see how it looks. Alright, you probably can't see this right now. The problem right now is that the robot is not quite distinct from the background, especially at the edges, so you just want to tweak this until we can sort of see the robot and have it stand out more from the background. If this glare is too much, you can always turn it down a little bit. As to the color of the lens, you may want to darken it a bit so it looks a little bit more realistic. This thing will stand out, so you can give it that same carbon fiber material. And yeah, so just remember that we want to highlight the parts of this robot that are important, and we don't want to highlight everything because that gets a bit confusing. We want to make sure the scene is not too overwhelming, and we want to have we don't want to distract the viewer's eye, so we want to have focus on some parts but not on every part because that is very confusing. Now one final tweak we can actually make to this is that we can change the carbon fiber material. Oops. So you want to select it here. Don't change it here, otherwise you'll change whatever is actually attached to it. We can link this to the actual roughness node. And it will also affect the roughness of the material as well. If we link it to the metallic, it will have the inverse effect. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And now we can render it. And we're pretty much done with our character. So we got a cool carbon fiber material going, some nice glowing cables, glowing vents, and a pretty flat backdrop. Now, if you feel like this is a bit too sharp, we can always scale it up so it's not too visible. Because sometimes the background can leave artifacts in your image which you really don't want. So just give this a quick render and keep tweaking until you're happy with it, but there aren't too many major changes I think you should do. Alright, so if you enjoyed this video and you actually managed to make a robot character, as this will be the end of our guide series, then thanks for watching, and drop a like if you liked it. Consider subscribing to my channel if you like this sort of content and you want me to make more of it. And yeah, thanks, I'll see you in the next one.